These aren't your grandma's ghost stories. In fact, your grandma's ghost stories might not even be true. Hello my spooky crew, and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if this is your first time here. My name is Alex and thanks for coming to my spooky corner of the internet. It is finally October. I am so excited for spooky season. This is my favorite month. It's also my busiest season, so you know, y'all hang in there with me. This year I decided to get some spooky ghosty sweaters. I only got two, so I'm gonna wear one for this week and I'll wear one for next week's video. I'm super excited. And another thing that's exciting that's happening is my book has finally been released. My book, One Bed Over, A Hospital Haunting, came out on Saturday, October 2nd, and it is all about my experience with basically a spirit attachment that I had gotten after a devastating car accident. You probably may have seen it, may have seen the episode on haunted hospitals. It's season 3, episode 12. I think the episode is titled They Followed Me Home, but that whole experience was covered on haunted hospitals, and many people were captivated by it. They had questions about it. And of course, that show, the segment was only about 18 minutes long, and this was an ordeal that lasted for quite a long time, so they couldn't include everything that had happened into the episode. You can check it out. You can get it on paperback and Kindle, and yeah, head on over to Amazon. You can also click the link in the description for a link to order the book. I am also selling personalized copies on my website, so if you go to my website, alexmatsuo.com/books, you can snag a personalized copy from my Etsy shop. And yeah, we're good to go with that. And once I finish writing one book, I'm starting on another project, so if you want to get some sneak peeks on the book that's coming out after this one, if you join my Patreon, you'll get to see snippets and unedited versions of my upcoming book that'll be coming out next year. And also, if you become a Patreon, you can get to see bloopers. So basically, when I mess up doing a video, you can see the bloopers from that, as well as kitty videos and all sorts of fun stuff. I'm still working on it. I just launched it maybe a month or so ago, so it's growing. It's slowly growing. So you can also get access to live streams, one-on-one chats, access to my haunted locations before I investigate, so I'll call you and you can talk to me about what you're feeling, what you think I should do at the haunted location. Tons of fun. So you can go to patreon.com/the spooky stuff. All right, enough updates. So, all right, let's talk about let's talk about being woke. So I had put out a tweet on social media, and I put out a TikTok video about this. So basically I said, hate to break it to y'all, but most ghost stories, lore, and legends are whitewashed, straight-washed, and Christian-washed, as well as gender-washed. I didn't include that in the tweet. And I basically said the same thing in the TikTok video. I said something like, what's something that the paranormal community is not ready to hear? And my thing was, you know, ghost stories, legends, lore are whitewashed and so on and so forth. And man, on TikTok, it's almost at like 20,000 views, and I'm just kind of blown away by it. I also did a blog about it. That's getting really good traction. It's interesting because as one of the replies that I got was that it was woke paranormal, and I also got called a social justice warrior of the paranormal, and it kind of boggles my mind a bit. So that's a lot to process. Really, where did this come from? Why did I put something like this out there? I started reading a book called Ghostland by Colin Dickey. Really good book. I'm still working through it. Honestly, I think it should be required reading for any ghost hunter or paranormal investigator because it brings up some interesting points that I've had in the back of my mind for a while. In fact, I kind of explored this idea with my very first book, which was The Haunted Actor. You know, exploring paranormal beliefs through theater, and so analyzing plays and musicals and how they express society's belief in the supernatural for their respective time period. So this is something that's always kind of been in the back of my mind. And then I read Ghostland, I started reading Ghostland by Colin Dickey, and it kind of gave me a lot of validation for a lot of suspicions that I've had in my paranormal journey. I was also very cautious in expressing this opinion depending on what group I was sharing it with, because some people get really sensitive when you tell them that a beloved ghost story or legend or lore that they've known their whole lives may have been made up, or it was made up with a bias, or it was stolen from another culture. A lot of people are not ready to have that conversation. So let's talk about it right now. Let's see how this goes. But before we get started, be sure to click on that subscribe button, give this video a like, and be sure to click on that notification bell so that you'll be the first to know when I upload a new video. And of course, if you want more articles about ghost hunting, paranormal investigation tips and tricks, ghost stories, lore, and all that good stuff, then head on over to alexmatsuo.com or thespookystuff.com. They will go to the exact same website. Yep, I bought 2 URLs. All right, let's get started. Okay, so I think it's important to note about what a ghost story means to us as humans. For historians and anthropologists and sociologists, they're incredibly important in shedding some light on a time period. So what was the economy like? What was the religious climate like? What did people believe in? You know, that sort of thing. You know, what was the role of women during that time period? It gives us a spotlight into a time that we are no longer a part of, so it gives us some hints and tricks and clues as to what's going on. So what's interesting is when you're looking at these fictional ghost stories that were found in like magazines of the time, 70% of those submissions came from women, and submitting ghost stories as a woman was a way to fight society standards, social norms, and honestly, it's really fascinating when you look at it. I think ghost stories also make it easier for us to digest difficult information. I think this might be something really hard for people to digest, but I think ghost stories kind of give us a security blanket when it comes to dealing with difficult things. Like, it makes it spooky, but it's like a fun, creepy spooky, not a, oh my gosh, our country is full of terrible people scary. But here's the issue with most ghost stories today. They silence the voice of marginalized groups. Here's an example of that: the ancient Indian burial ground trope. Colin Dickey has talked about this quite extensively. People who are of indigenous background have expressed major issues with it. This is also a trope that we see often in ghost hunting shows. And even people who are of a different religious belief, like practicing witchcraft, you know, automatically on TV it's looped into they were worshiping the devil or doing occult practices like it's so evil. And the paranormal community, you know, kind of takes a hint from paranormal TV that's honestly has a very Christian bias to it, and it treats people of marginalized groups as the other. So the whole othering is happening where they're treated like they're evil or vengeful and whatnot. It's honestly a bit disturbing. But it also doesn't stop at TV. I mean, even in like ghost walks and ghost tours that you may go to when you're visiting a new city, you know, they may even talk about things like, oh, these 2 men lived together and they were best friends and roommates, when really they had something more going on. But it seems like people can't handle the fact that, you know, maybe there are ghosts that could be queer. It's like ghost stories and legends and lore, and even stories of paranormal experiences in real haunted places are being used as escapism. And honestly, that whole thing is a bit concerning, especially when you look at haunted places like Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Now, they are better about this than other haunted locations with queer history, but a lot of like TV shows that have been to Trans-Allegheny, they will not talk about the queer history with the location. And yet, you know, so many homosexual men were sent there for practicing sodomy or just being gay, but yet we don't hear from those ghosts. And that actually also brings up the concerning thing with investigating haunted, you know, mental hospitals and asylums is, oh, these ghosts are so disturbed because they're crazy, when really these are spirits probably in pain, and they're for reasons that maybe were not crazy at all. They were just being normal human beings, like loving someone else. But the whole crazy mental asylum, unstable ghosts that could harm you, I mean, that is a story that sells. It sells on TV and it sells in haunted tourism. I was reading an article by a man named Paul Patterson. He has a PhD. He actually goes into like the history of ghost stories, and it's very interesting because ghost stories date back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. He made a note that the ghost stories back then, the ghosts were very like, they were just there. You know, they were trying to send a message, or they were wanting some sort of unfinished business resolved, like their body was buried in a mass grave, or they were murdered and left in a ditch and someone needed to go find their body. You know, they were just kind of there, more benevolent. But then when Gothic horror kind of came into the picture, I think we're talking like late 18th century, ghost stories started to become super dark and disturbing and violent. And ironically, that was how our paranormal experiences changed as well. I want to talk about the made-up ghost story as well. If you've ever been to a haunted city, or you've done a haunted tour in a new city, you know, there's a lot of ghost stories in haunted pubs and restaurants. I'm going to be brutally honest, most of these ghost stories are made up. It is human habit to try to fill in the blanks of things that we don't understand. I mean, look at religion and science. You know, when we weren't able to understand an illness, the devil was blamed. Hearing footsteps behind us, oh, it must be a ghost. We didn't realize that it was just squeaky floorboards. And something to consider when you hear about, oh, there's a murdered gunsmith that can be found in the wine cellar. Think about when that story came into prominence and who was the dominant social group at the time. You know, what was the dominant race? What was the dominant religion at the time? You'll see that those ghost stories favor heavily to whatever or whoever the dominant group was at the time. In the book Ghostland, Colin Dickey brings up the neighborhood of Shockoe in Richmond, Virginia, and he talks about this haunted section of town and how these ghosts in all the bars and restaurants in this area are all white. Well, Alex, that doesn't seem so weird. I mean, Richmond, Virginia has a lot of history with white people. Yeah, that's true, but just down the road, just maybe like a block or so away, was the location where slaves were bought and sold and tortured and killed. So why is it that the ghost stories in that area, the ghosts are all white, when in the same area, thousands, if not millions of slaves were wronged, like horribly wronged? And if we're basing ghost stories on trauma, then why aren't we seeing more black ghosts in this area? Because the dominant group doesn't want you to hear or see about it. It taints that neighborhood's reputation. It's difficult to talk about. We don't want to face that hard part of history. And so the white ghosts become the dominant narrative. And Colin Dickey makes a really good point in this book. You know, it's easier to handle the murdered gunsmith or the prostitute that met her end. It's easier to deal with like those stories in our heads, but we can't face reality. We can't face how horrific that chapter of history was. So again, that goes back to ghost stories being used as a security blanket. So really, it goes back to that idea of ghost stories being used as a security blanket. And here's another issue too with this whole thing of, you know, ghost stories throughout history. The ghost stories we have today, we have them because the dominant group was able to preserve them, meaning that they learned how to read, they learned how to write. Their families weren't brutally unalived. They weren't silenced. Whereas when you have marginalized groups, especially slaves, you know, who were not allowed to read or write, you know, they weren't forced to assimilate to American culture like, you know, Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants during World War II who had to basically assimilate to America. You know, those stories are essentially lost, especially when we just go back to the Elizabethan era with, you know, peasants. You know, they didn't know how to read or write. And there are millions of stories that have been lost because of that. Yes, oral tradition has helped a bit, but it's not a good substitute. Like, for example, in the 30s, you know, the government started the WPA project, and they were trying to get stories from former slaves around the 1930s, 1940s, because the people who lived during that time were starting to pass away. And they were taking their stories with them. So the government was trying to do the WPA project to preserve these stories, including their ghost stories. And they had their own ghost stories to help protect each other from slavery and white men. It's actually very interesting. I mean, when you think about the dominant group and how they're able to control the narrative, so to speak, I mean, Thomas Jefferson's ghost is a great example of that. At his home in Monticello, I've heard it both ways. You know, Jefferson's ghost has been seen around the property. You know, he's very benevolent and happy and whatnot. Meanwhile, you know, you're thinking about he had over 600 slaves, and then of course he had Sally Hemings. You know, it's like, what? You know, what? Okay. I mean, hardcore believers, you know, you may be able to tell me something about that. Like, why is it? Maybe is it because all the spirits of enslaved people were able to move on to the light and not hanging out around here? Maybe, but, you know, like I said, I think most of these stories are made up, so why aren't we making up stories about marginalized groups and their ghosts? But the other thing we need to think about is the role of bias in paranormal experiences and paranormal stories. It's hard. It's hard to think about that because we don't want to think that we have a bias, but we do. Like, example, I hear something growling in my living room and it's not any of my cats. Someone might think it's a demon, and that's based on their religious bias. Or if I hear a story about a little girl in a basement, when I interact with a ghost in a basement, I'm assuming it's the little girl. So bias plays a critical role in how we experience the paranormal and how we preserve the legacy of the paranormal. I mean, even with psychic mediums, I've noticed that there's a bias based on their own personal history, their religion, their sexuality, their race. That plays a role in how they read a location as well. I mean, I can bring 5 different mediums into a location, all with different backgrounds and lifestyles, and they'll all pick up something different. But I've also done something similar where I've brought in mediums from the same group, whether it's race or religion or gender identity and whatnot, and they all have very similar readings. And I have to wonder, is it because they have a similar bias? Is there a way to fix it? I don't know, because, okay, you know, I don't like to talk about issues without proposing solutions. So I don't know if there's a way to fix it besides speaking out about it and just making people more aware of their bias and hopefully, you know, become more open-minded to different experiences that they might have. I mean, it's hard. It's really hard to come to terms with it because we are admitting that we're biased. We're absolutely biased, and we have to challenge our own biases, I think, in order to have a more fulfilled paranormal investigation or to have a more fulfilled paranormal experience. So when you do hear these ghost stories, take them with a grain of salt. I definitely recommend doing your research and seeing, you know, do the ghost stories line up with the history of the location? And yeah, just keep your eyes and your mind open as I tell people. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to give this video a like, subscribe to my channel, click on that notification bell. For some reason, if you don't click on that notification bell, I'll never hear from you again because YouTube is weird like that. And feel free to share this video with your friends and family who also enjoy the spooky stuff and maybe want to get the world rocked and say that their grandma's ghost story might not be true. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next round.